Okay, here we go. Thanks for being patient, everyone. I'm Don Genova, and I am the president of CMG Freelance. Workshop was organized by CMG Freelance, that's Canadian Media Guild, a voluntary union membership for working freelancers, and by CWA Canada Associate Members, which is a free union membership for students, volunteers, and precarious media workers. If you're a freelance or associate member of the union, you'll have access to a recording of this webinar. As a freelance member, you can access the recordings through logging on to cmgfreelance.ca. And as an associate member, you can access the recordings through the link in your e-newsletter. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type them into the chat box below the presentation. So welcome again, and I'm now going to bring on our speakers from femifesto, Shannon Yansopoulos and Farrakhan. I'm going to bring them on screen and introduce them. And thanks for being patient, since this is the first time we're using this new webinar system. And I think I've got them here. Now, 1 second, and there they are. So please introduce yourselves and take over.
Hi there, I'm Farrakhan. I'm with femifesto.
Hi, I'm Shannon Yansopoulos, and I'm another co-founder of femifesto.
And we're really excited about leading this webinar with you. We're going to be talking today about how to use the right words when you report on sexual violence in the media. And it's really built on a guide that we created now, 2015 it came out, a guide on talking about sexual violence in the media and how to report. I'm just going to turn this a little bit so you, yes, there we go. And how we're going to, thank you. And how we're going to talk about this is we're going to kind of go over and give some examples of what we've seen in the media, but also things that we've seen that have been really great and things that we're like, let's think of that one through. And this comes from actually both of us coming from a feminist background with this, but also being really committed to seeing media that speaks to these issues in really important ways, because we know that the media shapes the stories that we see all the time and have conversations with about sexual violence, especially in the past couple months. So when we talk about sexual violence, obviously we're talking about things that affect us. We're talking about things that affect our bodies. We're talking about things that affect our friends, our community members, people we know, people we love. And even if you're a journalist, you're not a superhuman and you are impacted by sexual violence. So take a moment, take a deep breath, because we're going to be talking about sexual violence for this full hour, and make sure that, taking care of yourself afterwards is really important. When we're talking about sexual violence, we're really talking about it as being part of a system, right? And that system is rape culture. And that word is used lots of different places. And we really like this example from Seattle Girl Army. And that's from a really amazing group of women that were going around and actually doing graffiti in their community to talk about consent and sexual violence. And this is one example. And I think it really speaks to how rape culture works. So it says, what is rape culture? Rape culture is where rape and sexual violence is an accepted and expected norm. Here's a big one, but it says too, it supports violence against us, makes rape seem okay. It tells us it's our fault and tells the perpetrators it's their nature. And so what we see oftentimes is how rape culture permeates our institutions, how our government has been also complicit in with this, how our people that are supposed to protect us are also complicit with this. So creating policies that actually create more barriers for survivors to get support, or actually create avenues to which sexual violence can flourish, such as the colonial system in Canada, residential schools, where a lot of sexual violence happened. And so really looking at this as something that wasn't important to Canada, and also was not something that just starts from one person or individual, but actually is a system that is used to control and police and violate women's bodies and feminize folks' bodies.
So we started this guide several years ago when we noticed that the term rape culture started to be used in mainstream media more often. And on one side of the coin, that's great because it is starting conversations, and that word is being adapted into the kind of popular lexicon. But at the same time, we wanted to look at the ways in which what kind of language and frameworks and imagery are being used when sexual violence is being talked about in mainstream media, because we know it has such a profound power to shape our conversations about sexual violence. So here's some of the things that have happened recently that are examples of rape culture. A university in Canada allowed students to chant at their frosh orientation a rape culture chant. And we saw the media cover that in very specific ways. We've seen songs that tell women, you know, you want it because of these blurred lines. Athletes who are charged with sexual violence are exonerated from the violence they enacted because of their status as men and as athletes and as white men and various other privileges, and whereas the survivors aren't given much support in the public sphere.
And they're dragged, like we see them dragged and not really supported at all, oftentimes maligned in the media. And what we also seen recently is people's, even their anonymity, which is court, like they're allowed to have some protections from the court, being kind of taken away.
And one way that we've seen rape culture enacted in our communities is by the way institutions react when sexual violence occurs. So oftentimes the reaction is for institutions to share safety tips that are generally geared towards feminized bodies, towards women, about what women should do to keep themselves safe from sexual violence. And we've seen police share tips like that several times. So what femifesto did in response, because we are working towards creating a consent culture, is we made a satirical infographic in response to that, kind of almost poking fun about the way that these tips work to shame and blame survivors for the violence and totally ignore any onus being put on the perpetrator, and really give us tips that are virtually impossible to follow, like don't go outside at any time where sexual violence can happen, like daytime, tea time, nighttime, afternoon, snack time. So, you know, we know that sexual violence actually statistically happens more often by folks that the survivor knows. So again, it's just thinking about how we're framing these conversations.
And really recognizing too that people uphold it. So it's not just about, when we talk about sexual violence, it's not just talking about a binary thing of the perpetrator and the survivor, but also talking about how people can be complicit in that. And I think this quote from Catherine Burrell, which obviously was one of the complainants against Jian Ghomeshi, and she said it was impossible for pathological abusers to operate and thrive without a network of collaborators. It takes a village. And rape culture is about that. It's about this idea that people participating, upholding, and maintaining myths about sexual violence and myths about who perpetrators are. They're not the guy behind the bush. It's not the guy with the trench coat or the creepy van. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, exactly that, those creepy vans. But it's actually the people we know, it's people we love. 80% of sexual violence survivors, they know the perpetrator that has sexually assaulted them. And so really looking at how we can dismantle that idea that it's somebody just over there, but it's actually someone in our communities. And in Canada, 460,000 sexual assaults happen every year. And that's a really important thing to note. This is not one kind of case or two cases. This is an epidemic in Canada. And it's an epidemic across the globe. And it's important to recognize, too, that majority of survivors don't go to the police. And one of the things that we want the media to understand is, how do you report stories that are not always about the survivor going to the police? How do we talk about this in different ways? Recognizing that survivors are not accessing the justice system in droves, they're actually not going. And it's less than 10% of survivors actually report it to the police. And so that really shows that out of 1,000 sexual assaults that happen in Canada every year, 33 are reported to the police. So we know such a small percentage. And then even going further down there, 29 are reported as a crime, 12 have charges laid, 6 are prosecuted, 3 lead to convictions, and 997 assailants walk free. That doesn't mean that sexual violence hasn't happened, because actually less than 4% of sexual assaults that are reported to the police are false claims. And so it's important to recognize that there's a myriad of reasons why these cases don't go forward to court cases, and also don't get, the assailants actually can walk free. There's multiple reasons, and a lot of those have to do with how complicated our criminal justice system is, and how it's not really made oftentimes for survivors.
We also, as journalists, you know this, need to recognize that no language is neutral. And really the words that we're using to talk about sexual violence have a deep impact on the community that are reading those stories. You know, we always want to assume there is a survivor in the room and that they're listening in. And this pyramid kind of speaks to all of the different layers of rape culture and how it plays out in our communities. So you can see at the bottom things that folks might name as, it's just a joke. I was just being funny. Why are you getting so tight? Rape culture, quote unquote, jokes actually feed into the idea that sexual violence is okay and it's an accepted and expected norm. And then moving up the pyramid, looking at how things like traditional gender stereotypes, different racist stereotypes also make people more vulnerable to sexual violence, as well as kind of painting. If we assume that we had a gender binary, that men are somehow naturally predators and women are somehow naturally need to protect themselves and should be blamed for anything that happens to them.
And it contributes to an unsafe environment for survivors, right? And just people in general. So if someone knows that comments are being made in the workplace about people's bodies and they're being ignored and not challenged or intervened out, when things escalate, which they do, then people may not feel as safe and comfortable to come forward. And so really looking at sexual violence and kind of pyramid, and not only reporting on things like sexual assault and penetrative rape, but actually speaking about the importance of recognizing that harassment is apparent and not okay. Recognizing the fact that threats and verbal abuse actually contribute to a culture of shame and blame and persecution of people. And it's especially important to recognize that, because we don't actually see the conversations always about other forms of sexual violence. It very much time focuses on, I think, rape and sexual assault, right? And we really want to see the range happening. So we wanted to explain that.
So I think it's really important for everyone to understand the definition of consent. Consent is a voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. It means communicating yes on your own terms. And this is a really fantastic image from Planned Parenthood that we love, with an acronym about the definition of consent using French fries. So it's freely given, reversible, meaning can be revoked at any time. It's informed, it's enthusiastic, and it's specific.
Yeah, in Canada, I think a lot of people watch CSI or all the special victims unit shows, and they sometimes assume that we have the same sexual assault laws in Canada as they do in the States. But actually in Canada, we have affirmative consent laws. So that means that a yes means yes. It's not a no means no law, and that's important for you to know as a journalist. And in Canada, like, it's really important also to know that consent has to be active and continuous. That means that if I consent to something at 7 o'clock and I send a text message and I say, I can't wait to have sex with you, if I, decide at 11 o'clock when I finally meet up with you that I don't really want to have sex, then that actually isn't a consensual act. It's also important to recognize too that if someone is drunk or under the influence of drugs or unconscious, including asleep, they cannot give consent. Also, if it's done under threats or coercion, it's not consent. And the other piece too is on the case of fraud or exercise of authority. So if I'm a teacher or I'm a doctor or I'm your boss and I'm pushing you to have sex or pushing you to be in a sexual situation with me, that's actually not okay, and that's not consent. And it's shown actually sometimes when journalists don't understand consent and the laws, the way in which we actually write the headlines. So this is an example from the Toronto Sun by a journalist, and he actually used the word tryst to describe a relationship between let's put relationship in quotes, relationship between a 12-year-old young woman and I think the man was 25 years old. And so we call it a tryst. And a tryst kind of gives us this understanding of a relationship or something like the two of them were mutually agreed to be in that relationship. It doesn't recognize actually that it's unconsensual, that relationship, for multiple reasons. One, they were a teacher. And two, they actually were someone in a position of power, in a position of authority, and they can't get consent. So even when writing headlines, how do you hold the space of understanding Canadian law and write that and make sure that's clearly stated in the headline?
So it's also important to know kind of some of the facts about sexual violence. If you look through our guide throughout, we have lots of statistics about sexual violence and what that looks like, because we know that there's been a lot of myths perpetrated about it. So one that's important to know is sexual assault victimization rates are 5 times higher for women under the age of 35. So a lot of times when we are doing this work and creating a consent culture, we do a lot of it online because we know a lot of youth engage in social media. And that's partly why we started the Use the Right Words campaign, where we take headlines and we encourage advocates, community members, journalists to engage with us and change the headlines so that they are ones that create a consent culture. And here's one example. A 14-year-old, originally it said 14-year-old girl forced to have sex with 110 men in just one day. But we know that sexual violence is not about sex, it's about violence. So using the word sex actually implies that there was consent. So we changed this image to say 14-year-old girl was raped by 110 men. And that more clearly tells the story for readers.
It's also recognizing as a reporter to explore the reasons why many survivors don't report and not say that they're not legitimate survivors or not a part of understanding this work is understanding that many people don't report. And so one of the major reasons people don't report, and Shannon and I have numerous times had these conversations that most people we know don't, is that they may be fear of repercussions. There's research that shows that survivors often say that, it wasn't so bad, like that idea that we've created in the media that it has to be so bad, it has to be, a weapon involved for it to be seen as something serious. And that's not something we want to give off because we want people to actually know that whatever's happened to them is a violation and not okay. And a part of that work is actually unpacking the myths of and understanding the reality of why people don't report. Another example too is that people in positions of power oftentimes hold that authority, and it's difficult to report somebody in a position of power. An example of that in Ontario, our SIU division collects stats about people making complaints to the SIU. And one of the second highest complaint in Ontario for the past number of years has been sexual assault by police officers. Last year alone, 41, I believe it was 41 police officers were reported as being reported to the SIU about sexual assault. And so it's really important to recognize that this is a part of these conversations and understanding the barriers and hurdles that survivors had to go through to make that report and why many people don't. And it's based on race, it's based on class, it's based on so many systemic factors and social location, and really holding space for that.
Another thing we recognize in our work and in the guide is that media makers don't exist in a vacuum outside of rape culture. So we know that journalists do also experience sexual violence while on the job. And this is an infographic from our guide. 62% of women journalists report having experienced verbal sexual harassment while on the job. This is also obviously a big concern, and in our guide we give guidelines about some steps you might choose to take if you do experience sexual violence while working.
And we've seen it ourselves. So a couple of months ago, doing an interview with a reporter about the Ghomeshi trial, a man yelled "F her right in the pussy" as I was doing the interview. And so I asked her, is this the first time you've heard that today? And she said no. And so this is the thing. We know that journalists face a lot of harassment, both online, in person, sent to them. And so creating spaces at your, and I know some people are freelancers, but creating spaces that have your back, ensuring that you have a group of people that can check in with you. There's a great project called Troll Busters that we really actually use a lot, and it's coming out now to actually support people who are getting harassed online specifically for journalists. But looking at things like that and making sure that we have each other's back, we're checking in, and we're asking social media sites that we're on, especially Twitter, for a lot of freelancers that they're on Twitter, to actually support people when they get harassed. And we started this guide in 2011. We started looking at issues of sexual violence in the media and how it was being reported, because we saw the media as the place to which shaped conversations about sexual violence, and also saw ourselves as people that were advocates around ending sexual violence, that we wanted to work in partnership with journalists. We don't want to work in places where we're like journalists over here and advocates over here, but actually, how do we have these conversations? How do we want to see media written, and how do we want to see survivors' stories heard to make sure that we can end sexual violence? Because you are oftentimes the people that can make sure that those stories can be heard and actually these conversations happen.
So when we worked on our guide, we actually did media scanning for 5 years, starting in 2011, and collecting articles in a Canadian context that covered sexual violence. And we looked for trends that we saw in terms of language used, the frameworks used to discuss sexual violence, as well as the imagery that was used. And so within the guide, there's a lot of different resources, but they do include 2 tip sheets that are kind of easily digestible. You can download them as single documents from our website for free, and you can just use them whenever you're writing an article and kind of as a step-by-step guide.
We also did a survey while we were to talk to the community about what they saw. We had over 20 people on our advisory committee, analysts, community advocates, survivors, lawyers, all kinds of folks, which was really cool from across Canada. And it was really amazing to learn from them and actually crowdsource the document that you see now, and really make sure that it was actually hearing what the community was experiencing. And some of these are from our survey. And one of the things that I really thought was really potent to me was this anonymous quote that came, and she said, "I feel the incident of assault is often met with 2 main responses. It's not that bad, or what did she do to deserve it?" And that was asking survivors what they actually experienced when media did report on this. And I think things have really changed in the past, even I would say in the past 2 years, even a year, how we've seen reporting done, because there's been such a conversation happening in Canada, but we can do better. And really having an intersectional approach around this is really important. As you know, as a woman of color, as a Muslim woman, sometimes I see the way in which conversations come up around sexual violence sometimes make it either a very monolithic group of survivors, so not recognizing that different communities face different barriers to accessing services, to accessing healing, to being believed, right? And then on the other side of it, we also see that survivors who are from marginalized groups being dragged in the mud almost for their impact of sexual violence, kind of seeing, well, they were asking for it from being from a community or asking for it from the job that they have, such as sex workers. And so really having an intersectional approach when reporting and having that experience actually allows us to have the nuance and important stories that we need.
So there's a really fantastic study that was done, and we refer to it in our guide. It was done by Kirsten Gilchrist. And one of the things she found is that her quote, Aboriginal women received 3.5 times less coverage. Their articles were shorter and less likely to appear on the front page. And that was in a study that compared media coverage of sexual violence enacted against Indigenous women versus white women. And so, you know, this is really speaks to, I think, whose stories get heard, whose stories are told, and as a result, whose bodies are painted as quote unquote unrapeable or not deserving of support, not deserving of safety.
And so part of this is, of course, making sure that who we get to speak and how we work with survivors. So oftentimes as an advocate, I get a call, you know, can we have a survivor come speak to our camera? You know, we have about an hour. Can you get somebody together? And oftentimes I'm like, no, actually, because we can't just like go out and just find someone right away. And also it's like being respectful of survivor stories. So how do we do that? How do we actually, if we're going to interview survivors, how can that look? So interviewing survivors, one of the things we really want people to know is connect with resources. So have resources on hand. If you're going to have a survivor in the room, in the space, either on TV or on the radio, do you know the resources in your community that if they are triggered or they need extra support after the interview, that you can provide for them, even before, so that they know that they have support? The other piece that we want you to think about is reflect. Like, think about how the survivor is experiencing this, what they've gone through to be here, and be empathetic when they're speaking. I know you all do this, but just a good reminder. Another part is check our assumptions. Sometimes when we come in for an interview as a survivor, I've done interviews, and one of my favorite ones is if somebody said, oh, I didn't expect you to look like that. And I said, what do you mean to look like that? And they were like, I thought you looked like, you know, and they couldn't say it, but I know what they were saying, like a feminist, what their assumptions of feminists look like. Yeah, Shannon's face. But I think it's like thinking about like even just our assumptions about what people look like or how they are, or the expression that, you know, we're supposed to be sad or we're supposed to be not sad or not supposed to have feelings, like all the different pieces that come with that. Also, we want people to do is no two survivors are the same. So one survivor may react in a very specific way and go to the police. Another survivor may never talk to the police, and the first time they speak about it is to you. No survivor is the same, and so we don't want to make that assumption, right? And the other thing is respecting survivors' boundaries. Survivors may say to you that they're comfortable doing things on radio, but not on air. They're comfortable saying one name, but not their full name. They may be comfortable speaking about a specific subject, but not another. Just like we talk about consent in sexual relationships, the consent between you and a survivor when you're doing those interviews is just as important. And giving that informed consent is really important.
And it definitely is important if the survivor gives you specific needs about what they want to be confidential, that can be directly linked to safety risks that are really real. So make sure that everyone on your team understands that, including editors, photographers, social media content creators, so that everyone's on the same page and that survivor safety is respected.
And really checking in how do they identify? So a survivor may say, I use the word survivor, and we're using the word survivor a lot, but for some people that's a word that reflects on them. So they may say, I like the word victim, or I like you to use my name, and I like to say the person impacted by sexual violence. Checking in with someone how they see it is really important. Another part to look at is have informed consent. So again, will it be repeat show? Will it be aired again? One of the best examples I had with this was I did a radio interview with a young survivor, and she had told the producer that she didn't want to answer a specific question. And when she went on air, the producer still put that question in, and the on-air host asked it, and the survivor took a moment back and then told actually that she went forward with a question, but afterwards was like, I actually wasn't comfortable with that. And kindly enough, the on-air personality and the producer recognized it, apologized to her, and also did not do a repeat of that show. And it was really important for us to have that. And I think sometimes even being open to that kind of feedback and critique sometimes is really great. And I've seen really fantastic examples of reporters holding space for survivors' boundaries and understanding that this has huge impacts on them for the rest of their lives. This is not just one story for them, this is their lives. Another part too is thinking about format and safety. So as Shannon said really clearly, sometimes some formats will work for others and some it will not at all. So can you maybe muffle their voice, or can you use a screen, or can you find ways to show that what they're saying is absolutely important, but they may not want to be their face being the seen. Another two is explaining the interview process to them. So sometimes folks who don't have media training, and lots of survivors don't, making sure they understand what the interview process is, that everything is on the record, that yes, you can say it off the record and on the record, but for a lot of survivors, they've experienced that sometimes that doesn't come true. So making sure that that's really clear for someone. And also how the process will go. It'll be a 5-minute interview. Here's some of the questions we'll be asking, or the themes we'll be talking about if you don't want to give the questions, but making that really clear. And you might want to do follow-up too. If it's a print article, can you do follow-up? So if there's a question that you're struggling with of how to speak about, check in with the survivor instead of making, maybe the challenge can be of not actually having a conversation, but it's super important.
And I think just on the point about following up, each survivor is really their own expert on their own story and how they would like to interact with the media. So there's always, I think, something to learn. So following up with them after the interview to ask how it went, is there anything that would have changed? And then I think we can keep the dialogue open in that way.
And some examples to ask survivors during an interview, these were actually this was actually coming from journalists we were talking with. They were like, okay, so we're learning what not to ask, but what should we ask?
So when we did a survey actually with journalists when we were making this guide, one of the requests was that we provide them with a series of sample questions that can be asked to survivors that aren't survivor blaming or shaming. And so some of the ones we came up with is, what do you think is important for people to know? How has this experience impacted you? What services, resources, / people helped you in your healing? And so why I think some of these questions are preferable is that they're not making any assumptions about what type of justice that we think that survivors should be looking for in order to be kind of quote unquote the ideal victim. And we're giving them space to share the details of the story that they want to share. Asking questions such as, well, why didn't you tell anyone? Why did you stay? What were you wearing? Those kind of questions can kind of lead us down the dangerous path of suggesting that survivors are somehow to blame for what they were wearing, what they were doing, or how they reacted to the violence. And that's something that we always want to avoid. Other questions are like, what were the barriers to you coming forward are really important, because it allows for us to understand the different structures that are at play that might prevent different communities from accessing justice. And it can help shed a light on what we as our community can do to support survivors better. And finally, what suggestions do you have to make it safer for other survivors to come forward? And that, I think, gives survivors a chance to speak back to the systems that are supposed to be supporting them and what they would like to see changed.
And ways to do, so people oftentimes, again, call us to say, can I speak to a survivor? To circumvent that and actually create relationships really helps in terms of us moving forward around this issue. So actually building those relationships even before you have a story that you need, so that survivors know who you are and their organizations know who you are in your community. So building and solid relationships, actually getting to know the community agencies in your area, checking in with them when you're writing a story, even if you're not going to ask them for a quote, making sure that they know, and having that relationship actually builds it. And you all know this. One of the big things we often say is offer training. So offer training actually to community agencies and survivors so that they feel safer to speak to the media and actually are prepared to and understand what the process looks like. They actually can practice what being on screen looks like. They can practice what being on radio looks like and actually have that space for them. And the third part is, of course, creating a list. And I know you already have huge media lists yourselves, but creating a list of folks that you can call frontline workers, because oftentimes frontline workers, non-academics or people that are doing this work, we want to make sure that there's lots of different folks that are talking about it. So it can be frontline workers, it can be researchers, it can be frontline folks that are in the shelters or maybe in the sexual assault centers. It can also be survivors that are in the community, making sure they know they can also call on you to provide their knowledge about a subject.
So next we're going to go through some real examples of pieces from our Use the Right Words campaign, where we saw real headlines, and then either we or communities that were engaging with us online made changes to make them more supportive of survivors. And we're going to start with some do's and don'ts that are also on our language checklist. So this first headline read, originally, Bill Cosby admits to drug-filled sexual encounters with teens in deposition report. So right off the bat, we can see that there's a lot wrong with this. Using the words sexual encounters, again, it erases that any violence happened, and it makes it sound as if this was consensual. Drug-filled is really subtle, but potent victim blaming.
And salacious. It's so salacious, and it's like almost creating like more of a scandal than an actual issue of sexual violence.
So we said there, we fixed it, and we changed it to Bill Cosby admits to drugging and sexually assaulting teens in deposition. So what's one thing that's really important with language is, like Farah was mentioning earlier, consent with words. Do respect the survivor's autonomy by using language of their choice. For example, using the term sex worker rather than prostitution, as that's the language that the community has said that they prefer. Ask the survivor what gender pronouns they use, be it she, he, or they, and make sure that you're always using their correct gender pronouns. And here we have one example. We see this all the time in headlines. It originally said prostitute sexually assaulted, and we changed it to say sex worker. And that's really important to respect survivors' autonomy.
Also, the use of gentle words. So we saw at the UBC Frost Chance, they actually initially said many media sources reported as a non-consensual sex. Well, what's non-consensual sex? It's rape. So use the words. Don't be ashamed. Don't be scared about using words that actually speak to what's actually happening there. And it's important because when we put non-consensual sex, it kind of almost distills it and makes it seem like a soft, kind thing, and it's not. Also, thinking about speaking about this again is like use language that conveys that sexual assault is not sex, it's violence. And that's a really important thing because too often we see the two kind of interchangeable, and it's not. And describe it as not a sex act, but actually describe it as sexual violence. So here's another example. Man jailed for getting 11-year-old pregnant. No, he wasn't jailed for getting 11-year-old pregnant. He was in jail for raping an 11-year-old and be really clear what happened there. And we could say, you know, people are maybe more comfortable because under the Canadian code, the criminal code, it's sexual assault. I would have been happy if it said man jailed for sexually assaulting an 11-year-old, and that would have been fine. But I think it's really important to use words that speak to actually what they did.
Another thing we see very commonly is the overuse of the word alleged. We really understand that using the word alleged is important for legal reasons in some cases. But here's an example. This was a case about the former Ontario Premier was taken to court because he was accused of sexually harassing an employee. And in this article, the word alleged was used over 8 times. So that seems excessive, and the word alleged really works to cast doubt in the reader's mind, whereas we've seen many other articles about the very same case, about the very same topic, that use other words like said, according to a report, that are more neutral and don't have the same connotation.
And again, you want to really make sure that if people say unwanted in this one, like another example, like unwanted intercourse. Unwanted intercourse, again, is sexual assault. So really making sure that we're using the words that actually name what's happening there and naming it as violence. So now we're on to frameworks, and frameworks are how course, how we shape stories about sexual violence. So example of some framework, right, that's really important is recognizing that systemic oppression and inequality make people in marginalized communities more vulnerable to sexual assault and pose challenges to them accessing supports. So we've seen this in media when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women facing multiple barriers. We see that in Quebec right now, they have a phone line for women that have been assaulted by the police that they can call to report that. That speaks of multiple barriers that Indigenous women are facing in Quebec when it comes to sexual violence. We need that named in the media so it doesn't seem that every sexual assault survivor faces the same barriers, but actually speaks to the multiplicity of ways in which our social location impacts the way we access supports and experience sexual violence. Also, not suggesting that people from marginalized communities are somehow to blame for experiencing disproportionately high levels of sexual violence, and making sure that we recognize where this is stemming from. So an example, again, is with Indigenous communities, really naming that colonialism is a part of why Indigenous communities continue to experience and are subjected to high rates of violence. And also making sure not to focus on who the survivor is, including if they have addictions, or their clothing, or employment, or their marital status, or their sexuality, if they were a sex worker, or if their past relationships. That doesn't mean that what happened to them was okay. And it also doesn't mean that we need to focus on that. And I think it's really important to recognize that too often when people are sexually assaulted or experience violation that are from marginalized communities, we focus very much on negative parts, or what we deem is negative. Let's be real, what we deem is negative of what they've been going through, and kind of blaming that. Whereas someone who is, and we're going to talk about this, that is from a privileged community, we kind of still put in the parts about why they're so privileged. So we're going to explain that in a second.
So the next tip is don't sensationalize sexual assault or depict it in a gratuitous or voyeuristic way. And we saw this earlier in the headline about Bill Cosby. Again, in this example with Chatelaine, originally it said the timeline of the Ghomeshi scandal. And throughout the Jian Ghomeshi case, I think I've never seen the word scandal used more times in my entire life, all over Twitter, all over the media. And the word scandal really suggests that it's something to leer at. It's like entertainment news, but it's tabloid. It's tabloid. So it's really ignoring that, this is someone's life, and it was serious violence that, and we should be talking about it in that way. And here's another example from a tweet from a reporter that was with the Ottawa Sun. And again, this was kind of had a huge impact on social media. People were really upset, and it was called Trissgate. It originally said ex-PM Stephen Harper's former drummer has been sentenced to 2 years, in capital letters, as if that's so long, in jail for tryst with then 13-year-old girl student. And again, the word tryst is really has connotations of romance and like a romance novel or something.
And we see in media kind of the creation of this Lolita kind of framing of young women when they are sexually assaulted, and young girls almost creating this idea that they somehow are part of that sexual relationship. And that's almost us like participating in the grooming that happens with survivors. So when young women are sexually assaulted, there's a grooming period by perpetrators where they kind of convince the young person that they are almost colluding or a part of this relationship. And so when we name sexual violence, acts of sexual violence as a relationship, as a tryst, as something that's consensual between two parties, as if they have the same power, we're not recognizing that this is about violence, this is about power structures, this is about abuse of authority. And we name that name by the media so that when a young person reads that, they understand that this is not okay. And I think that, going back to almost the title of exoneration or just like putting in necessary details. So we just talked about the unnecessary details put in about a survivor. We see almost the opposite happening with perpetrators, specifically from privileged backgrounds. And Brock Turner, I think that case, we saw it time and time again in the way he was called like all-American swimmer, right? So celebrating his accomplishments, at the same time talking about the sexual assault that he did. And talking about as a Stanford swimmer. And let's be real, he is not allowed to swim in any competitive races anymore, and he doesn't go to Stanford anymore. He went to Stanford when he sexually assaulted her. It's also important to know, too, that the images that were used for a very long time were used of images of him at Stanford in his sweatshirt, being studious student. They weren't of his mugshot. They weren't using images that really spoke to what had happened, which is that he had been arrested for sexually assaulting an unconscious woman behind a dumpster and convicted. And we see the example of a great, we want, some great headline work and some not so great. So Time Magazine, and this is a tweet that I did around Time, and it says Stanford swimmer Brock Turner to be released from jail Friday, never giving any explanation of what he was in jail for and what he was doing. And of course, he was in jail for sexually assaulting a woman. And I've gotten some feedback that I shouldn't use the word rapist, but use actually the word sexual assault. And actually, I think that's great. And we saw the Globe and Mail actually do it right. And Globe and Mail said Brock Turner, Stanford student, and he's not a Stanford student anymore. I would say that, but convicted of sex assault, leaves jail after 3 months. That is a really good headline, and that speaks to actually what he did, what he was in jail for. And they put some personalizing piece with the school, but still allowed it to recognize why he was there. And if you look at the difference, the first one they didn't use his mugshot, but the second one they did.
So this is an important piece as well. Do you take sexual violence that is enacted online, such as threats and harassment, seriously? Don't downplay sexual violence by calling it things like bullying or cyberbullying as the sole problem. That kind of gives it the connotation like, we're in the schoolyard and this is, kind of minor incidents, but
or words don't matter.
Words don't matter. Words can't really hurt you. But this is 2016. A lot of people's work and lives are really intrinsically linked with social media platforms. So we need to recognize that violent threats, sexual harassment online is violence. And in this example, about a case, someone was calling it Twitter harassment, sees bullies come out to play, kind of making almost a joke about it. But this isn't just Twitter harassment. This is actually, it is violence, it is harassment. Just because it's online doesn't make that. And so the good, bad victim narrative. We see this really often in conversations about sexual violence, that there's this idea of the perfect ideal victim who's, a young, thin, cis, able-bodied white woman, alone at night, gets attacked by a stranger danger.
Well-educated,
upper class. And then there's this idea that if survivors don't fit all of those categories, then we are somehow should believe them less, or should they deserve less support and safety. And here's one example. We actually pulled this from police alerts, and we know that media work really closely with police in a lot of these cases, so we wanted to see how the police were talking about sexual violence. And in this case, they noted the incident was not reported to police until January 2016, although it happened in December 2015. But there's no reason to say not reported until, because that's suggesting that survivors should, like, why didn't they immediately report? And we know, like we talked about earlier, there's so many different barriers and reasons as to why that's not the case in the majority of sexual violence cases.
And so the next part, just checking in really, and we're going to do this really quickly probably, is really checking around imagery. So, and we have faced this ourselves with, you know, we'll submit an article for a news source, and then they'll put an image, and we go back and go, this is not the image that we would want with this. This person didn't consent to being linked to this article around sexual violence. So how do we make sure that we use images that actually speak to the issue and don't actually also fade into stereotypes? And one example that we always see sometimes is in universities. When we're talking about universities, we see images of women drinking. We talk about sexual assault on campus, which gives this idea that somehow people are asking for it when they're going out to drink, and somehow sexual violence on campuses only happens when people are drinking.
So here's a don't of an image that we often see, especially when we're talking about violence against women, is the image of a really victimized, kind of helpless woman. And I think we all know what violence looks like. I don't think we need to see it kind of promoted across social media all over our timelines when we're talking about sexual violence. Just like the cases of Black folks when they are murdered by police, and then it's kind of plastered all over social media. That kind of imagery can serve to continue to traumatize communities that are already faced with high levels of violence. So using imagery that doesn't highlight someone's victimhood is important.
Also, again, going back with the Brock Turner piece, really seeing that when we choose to use photos of people that are perpetrators, what photos are we choosing to use? And really important to think about what privileged folks don't actually end up sometimes getting the photos that other people do. So we see Black men when they are killed, there are pictures emerge of them that maybe show them in a light that is not flattering, compared to when white men sexually assault someone, we see them in very flattering photos with, you know, in the don't section where you see them, you know, smiling and their sweatshirt at university, or them going out to play soccer, and not really photos of really depicting what they did or their mugshot. So we are coming to the end of our webinar, and we want you to join the conversation. This conversation is something that cannot be done without journalists, and that's why we're doing this. This is not about actually blaming and shaming, but actually we want to work with you. And we can't actually end sexual violence without working with the media. The media holds so much power in terms of how you shape stories, and are so important to actually getting the word out that sexual violence is not okay, and that it happens in a myriad of ways. And we both have had great experiences with journalists. We're really lucky to have fantastic journalists on our actually advisory team, and still are able to call them and be like, how do we do this? How do we talk about this? And we hope that you will continue to be part of that conversation. We use the right words to actually give high fives to media sources when they do great stories about sexual violence, and actually to name kind of when things could be reported a little bit differently. And we want to continue working with you to make sure that we create a consent culture in the world. So here's one of the things that we love, otters, and we kind of want to be otters with the media. Otters hold hands when they are in rough waters, and it is difficult to report on sexual violence. So if you are ever in a point where you're like, I don't know about this, or how do I talk about this, please contact us. We're happy to help you. And kind of think consent culture is like building another world possible, kind of like a world that doesn't exist right now, like a sci-fi world. So we are mixing our otter with space, like otter space, which we think is really important.
We really want to hear from you. Please do join the conversation. You can get in touch with us on our website, usetherightwords.ca. We're on Twitter at femifesto, and we also have a Facebook page, or you can always email us. And Farah and my own Twitter handles are just at the bottom of the page there. And we do also have a list of resources. This is also in the guide that you can access. And there's actually a multitude of really helpful media toolkits that talk about the topic of sexual violence. And so we encourage you to take a look at all of them.
Great. Is there any questions that people have for us right now? Oh, Shannon, do you have any questions? Well,
so you can get our publication for free.
Oh, yeah.
We created it as a free tool on www.femifesto.ca. That's FEMIFESTO.ca. And
it's right here, or you can get it at usetherightwords.ca. It's the both.
Yeah, you can also get it at usetherightwords.ca, and you can download either the guide in its entirety, or you can download just the tip sheets alone as a handout.
And the tip sheets are things like the frameworks in language. There's a tip sheet for journalists on actually interviewing survivors. There's a tip sheet actually for journalists on if you're experiencing sexual violence in your workplace, because we recognize that that is a huge issue and we want to support journalists who are facing that. And recognizing too that this is for all genders, so we recognize that survivors can be from men, women, trans folks, and really recognize gender non-conforming folks. So really making sure that our guide speaks to that. The other things in the guide that I think are really helpful is also legal information. So what is sexual violence seen as in Canada by the criminal code, and what consent is in Canada. Also things like understanding what recanted, unfounded cases are in the police and how those are shaped. And understanding even how rape culture impacts survivors and how they access services.
Yeah, and we made this guide in the hopes of having a spark of a conversation. So we'd really love to hear from you. We do provide workshops, and we are continuing our campaign, #UseTheRightWord, on social media. So please do engage with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Shannon and Tara. That was an excellent, really distilled a lot of this that we don't think about as journalists a lot of time, and you had fantastic examples there. So thank you so much for that. This webinar recording will be available either through cmgfreelance.ca for freelance members or through the link in our regular newsletter for CWA Canada Associate members. Thanks to everyone, and we'll see you next time.